Okay, you're live. Okay. Hello, everyone. So we are about 40 minutes behind schedule. So we're going to try to shorten things up a little bit and see how we go. And we'll try to improvise. And thank you in advance for your flexibility, right? So we're going to try to do this in about 40 minutes, maybe a little bit less, depends on how you do, maybe 30. But what we want to do is make sure that we are flexible enough to deal with our needs. And if we are to recap here some trends that we are seeing today, which is great, is these great opportunity that we have to come together and talk to each other. Because one of the things that we talked about before, yesterday, was how we traditionally in our childhood, we have had an education or a formal education that has been based on instruction. It has been based on intellectual knowledge. It has been about putting content, stuff in our heads, right? And we are trying to do the shift because the new era demands it, to also ensure that we are giving our children the tools that are necessary for them to be able to negotiate relationships. Because more and more we see that children are going to need these skills because the world nowadays is no longer as black and white as it was before. Before, in the past generations and when we were younger, jobs were really well defined. Right? If you were an engineer, you did this. You went and worked from 8 to 5. You went to this factory. You went to that office. And it was very simple. But now more and more we see things are crossing over. When we look at careers, for instance, we know that people would change a careers an average of 5 or 6 times during their life. We're not talking about jobs. We're talking about careers, the things that they do. And so it requires a set of transferable skills that you can take with you from job to job, career to career. And these transferable skills are things that we were not traditionally taught. And they are how to relate with people, how to troubleshoot, how to problem solve, how to build teams, how to collaborate. And so, as we mentioned, not to kick the horse when it's dead, is that we have had a lot of emphasis in our lives, learning stuff, right? And nowadays, if I make a little parenthesis here, there's even a lot of talk about Common Core, some for you parents, because for parents today, it seems very confusing that you would do something different than what you used to do before. But what an attempt of Common Core is, to be clear, is an attempt to have a set of standards for the entire country, so that when you don't go from one state to the next, you don't find yourself being taught different things on third grade. Right? But it's also an attempt to do interdisciplinary work. So as you solve a math problem, you would use English writing skills to relay your answer. And that's very confusing for us parents because that's not how we were taught, right? And so there's a lot of resistance, which is only natural. Why do I say all of that? I say all of that because what we are seeing here in our past day and today is that we have fallen into that trap, even in our Spiritist group ourselves. We have activities when we come into the group, and we leave our group, and we may not have a chance to interact with people. We come in, we sit down, we listen, we have passes, we say goodbye, and then we go. You see what I'm saying? And that is okay. There's nothing wrong with this. I want to make sure that we understand this. I'm not criticizing the format of our meetings. What I am saying is, for us as Spiritist workers in general, we just want to be cognizant that that is a model that worked before, and it may be time for us to wonder whether we can inject a little bit of a human touch, a little bit more of a communal approach, so that when people come to our groups, they also feel the love that we have for them and the welcoming attitude that permeates everything we do. Because anybody that first comes to a group comes with an emotional need. They either come to a Spiritist group for one or two reasons. They come because there's something in their life that is not working out and they need answers. Or they're curious about Spiritism in general. The second category is rare. Right? I would venture a guess, an uninformed guess, that about 95% of cases we get in the Spiritist group is somebody coming because they have a problem of some sorts. So if they come into our groups and they sit down and they listen to a lecture, they get passes and they leave, do you think that is a good way for us to address their needs? Maybe not the best way in the world. Is that a bad way? No. But it could be better? Probably. So relationships come in, right, from a Spiritist worker perspective, in which we also have to make sure that we are paying attention and minding the relationships that we have with people who are coming in, right? But at the same time, we also have to be mindful of the relationships of the people who are already in, that sometimes we don't pay a lot of attention to because we have been set in this mode of intellectual learning, right? And so, for instance, we saw great joy today and yesterday on people getting together and doing group work. And people were excited about this, which means there might be an opportunity for us to rethink how can we make that a more current experience for members of the group, right? Maybe, I don't know, this is something that not only kids would benefit from. Maybe the big kids would also benefit from. Maybe in our study groups, we could start with a little bit of a circle experience before we dive into the material, so we build that sense of community, right? Especially because one of the concerns that people ask us as we go from place to place, and I think it's universal, is there's never enough Spiritist volunteers or workers to help to work in the group. If your group has enough volunteers and you have too many people helping, raise your arm. Right? So to make sure, I want to check my assumption, right? But at the same time, we oftentimes don't develop those relationships to give them an opportunity to do that. And so if they come into an activity that is passive, like public talk and so forth, but we don't connect and we don't build those relationships, how are they going to get interested and stay and help the community? So it's something to think about, right? Generally what we do is we have talks, but we also have study groups. And study groups are a beautiful thing because you have a chance to do circle in a roundabout way, right, with material. But we can also be intentional about doing circle work and doing a study group, right? Finding a protocol to start study groups includes this. But why do I say that? Because I think that study group is a really important part of our Spiritist experience. So that we come in for a public talk, and then step 2 is for us to get that person connected with other people and be part of the community, and that includes generally a study group so they understand things better, right? I say that because I feel like the role of the Spiritist group, or the Spiritist Center, has a lot to do with people. I often say that I think that we are in the business of helping people. We're in the business of people. Our goal is to make sure that everybody that comes through our doors leaves better than they have come in. It's as simple as that. Whether it's on that day or whether it's 6 months from now. And if we are lucky enough and we are able to develop great relationships, our secondary goal is to get them to a place where they can provide help for those that are coming in like them when they need help, right? That's a different conversation, though, about the role of the Spiritist group and so forth. But I say all of that because we do have a lot of us here today who are volunteers at the center. So I went off script a little bit to kind of toss that in there. But what I really want to focus on is relationships. Why? Because, is it a random topic? No. We all have to deal with relationships. And the truth is we all struggle with relationships, partially because of the context that we laid out, right? We never really taught how to mind and deal with relationships overtly. So we want to spend a very brief amount of time talking about relationships. I don't want to dive into why relationships are important. Normally I would, I talk about the importance of relationships and from a spiritual perspective, but I feel like Claudia has done a great job talking about it. We have talked about it before. Is that okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
So we're going to do an interactive thing, like we're going to skip some parts and we're going to try to do some things, right? And so we're going to skip some of the things here, and maybe one day this will work. Who knows?
Oh, so maybe you have to click it.
There you go. So a couple of things that we wanted to talk about in general, like if we were to narrow down, is we want to go back again to the idea of conflict. That is natural and it's inevitable. So we want to change our mindset about conflict. Point number 2 that I want to make, if I have the time too, is that connecting these relationships, they are essential to our spiritual growth, right? And communication is the key to relationships. If we don't communicate, we will not have a good relationship. So if it's okay with you, we're going to call a little bit of an audible, and we're going to focus the most of our part today on this key, on the communication piece, right? And connection is very important. And so what we want to propose to you today is to introduce you to something that you're probably already familiar with, for a method that is not Spiritist per se, but I feel aligns very much with the Spiritist idea of the importance of communications, right? Which is a little bit of what we talked about yesterday, nonviolent communication and compassionate communication. And why do I like that? Because we also think that communication is about an outward movement. It's about us saying stuff to people. Communication is way more than that. Communication is about listening and understanding what you're feeling. And that's something that we don't normally think about. But before we do that, we have to deal into the bulk of the connection piece, which is conflict, right? We have an aversion to conflict. We have been taught to avoid conflict at all costs, whether indirectly or directly. We do whatever we can to shove our feelings under the carpet. And sometimes when we do that, we start avoiding people because we don't want to deal with that conflict. And if we avoid people, relationships suffer. That's simple. Does that make sense? When things are like, your natural tendency is, I'm going to, stage left. I am going to run this way when that person comes in, and I don't have to talk to that person, so I don't have to deal with that. But what happens is our relationships hurt, right? So conflict, first of all, is not drama. We have this idea in our minds that conflict equals drama. Conflict has nothing to do with drama. Drama is what we make of conflict, right? Conflict is inevitable. Why is it inevitable? Because, like we said briefly yesterday, is the result of a need that was not met. You want something, whether you're conscious about it or not, you don't get it, and you go into odds with something else. So anytime there's two people, you are necessarily going to run into conflict. It's inevitable, because it's impossible for two people to be 100% of the time in sync. Right? Is it baloney? Does it make sense? Yes. So you experience conflict every single day in your lives, maybe every hour of your lives. The difference is some of those are hard for you because you don't have relationships with those people that you feel comfortable with, and they become drama. Right? So we want to prevent conflict from disconnecting us from others. That's key. Because if we're not talking, we're not building those relationships. We're not working those relationships. And relationships need to be worked on, right, as well. So make a long story short, conflict, the idea that we have of conflict in our minds require us to take a deep moment, breathe, and change our mindset about what conflict is. Conflict is an opportunity for growth. It's the simple act of mediating your needs in a way that you can take a step forward towards having your needs and the needs of the people you are interacting with met. It's not about winning your way. It is about meeting your needs. Because you can win an argument and not have your needs met. I will give you an example. You can fight with your spouse about something and win that argument, but you may not get the affection that ultimately you were seeking. Does that make sense? Sometimes our arguments are not for the things that they are about. They are deeper emotional things that come up, and then all of a sudden, in the moment that peanut butter jar falls on the ground, you go off at somebody else, and it has nothing to do with the peanut butter jar. It has to do with all these unexplored things within you that were brewing and that you never addressed. And all of a sudden, that peanut butter jar can bring you to the brink of divorce. It happens. Right? I'm not sugarcoating it, and I'm really trying not to be dramatic about it, but it does happen. Right? And sometimes the great challenges we have in life emotionally, they are not one episode. They are a series of episodes that have been collapsed or put together and built in because we didn't have an outlet for dealing with that conflict. So far, so good? So, how do we then think about communication? Because if we don't communicate, we will be unable to meet that need, to navigate that problem, right? And this is in the Spiritist group. This is at work. This is at home, right? Whatever it is that you're doing, wherever it is that you are, you have to find a way of navigating and solving for conflict. There are many different ways of doing that. It is up to you to find out what works best. And notice that Spiritism and the spirits will never prescribe one specific way of doing things because they respect our free will. So they will never say, you must say this, you must do this, and then 3 minutes later you need to do this. And then 5 minutes later do this, and then jump on one foot, and then high five the other person, and then all your conflicts are going to go away. That's why in Spiritism, we won't get these formulaic approaches to things. The good spirits are going to respect our free will, and they're going to point us in the right direction, and they're going to say, it's important for you to be reflective, it's important for you to mind your relationships, and it's important for you to have a great relationship with people and talk to them, but they won't say, here are the words that you need to do, here's the things that you need to say. And sometimes that's what we want, because we don't know what to do, and we want people to tell us, say this, do this, and that's what the hard part is, because we feel like, oh, what do I do? Right? So that's when we go outside and look for different methods that we can use to navigate those experiences. Circle is a great way of building community and talking about this and building vulnerability. I want to expose to you to a new one as well. I'm going to skip this part about the importance of reincarnation and so forth, relationships, because I think you get it, right? Can we do that? Can we skip that so we can go into the method itself? All right. So when we go into the communication method that I want to share with you is called compassionate communication. And it was brought forth by this dude over here. Oh, let me do this. Marshall Roseberg. And he's passed away, but he has done tremendous work. And he's got this book, which is really interesting. It's a really easy read. It's called Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life. Right? It's a really great book. And it's really simple for you. And there's many different others that you can look at. But what I like about the framework that he's come up with is it's really simple to remember. It's really meaningful, and it leads you to deep reflection about yourself. What do I mean by that? Communication, I feel, is an act of self-discovery. When we are really trying to navigate conflict, we have to ask ourselves why we are stuck on that thing. We should ask ourselves, right? So how do we do that? All right. So maybe we can get hands-on on this thing. Who's got an issue that they might want to come and talk to us with without disclosing the name that maybe the people that they're having trouble with, so we can talk through the situation and see whether there is a way in which we can communicate to make it more, make it easier for them to navigate conflict. Is there anybody out there? If not, I'll give you some examples, but hi. All right, let's volunteer. So tell us about a little bit about the conflict that you're experiencing and where you are with that.
So there's two different parenting techniques.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there is two different parenting techniques at home. I am trying to change my ways of working with the kids. My husband has more of his own approach of how he was brought up. I don't want to tell to him. I want to work with him and give him different tools that I think it works for me, but I am avoiding conflict so we don't fight.
Mm-hmm. Great. That's one. First of all, no, hold on. Hang in there. Hang in there. First of all, thank you for volunteering. I want to recognize that it's very hard to talk about this stuff in front of a bunch of people, right? And thank you for bringing this hypothetical case. So tell me, like, what's the heart of the problem?
When it gets, when he yells and when he gets physical to the children.
With the children, okay. All right, so let's try to use this compassionate communication method. Would you be okay if we use your example and kind of work it out?
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you for doing that. Let's give a round of applause. I think it's a very courageous piece, right? So it happens, right? So when parents have different perspectives on how they want to address challenges with the kids, it's obviously a conflicting situation, right? So if we were to follow Rosenberg's method, right, he would tell us there's 4 different steps that we need to go through. One of them is making an observation about what's happening. Because oftentimes we make very big judgments about things and it breaks down our communication. For instance, if hypothetically you were to turn around to your husband and say, you always raise your voice when you talk to our kids. Do you think that's going to make him more likely or less likely to hear what you're saying next? Right? Do you think that's an observation?
No.
No. That's a generalization. Right? It's actually a veiled emotional attack. Right? So when we talk about making an observation, it's very important for us to distinguish that we need to make a clear observation. Right? And then here's the tough part. We need to state our feelings so people understand how we feel about it. And more importantly, so we know how we feel about it. Because we might have left that bubble inside of ourselves and not know how that affects us or why that affects us or what is actually affecting us until we think about how that makes us feel. And I'll tell you, it's very difficult. We're going to go in more details here. So we're going to kind of break this down a little bit more, right? And part number 3 is we need to identify what is that we need to happen. Because if we don't know what we want, how can people meet our needs? Right? Sometimes we have things that we don't know, but we kind of lash out. Right? I'll give you an example that kills unaware husbands everywhere. And for that matter, wives too, because I've seen both ways. Is when one of the spouses turns to the other one and says, I'm mad at you at what you've done, and you don't even know what you've done, so I'm not going to tell you. Right? Like, am I making things up? This happens. This happens, right? Right? This happens. So, do you think this ever will solve anything in the world? Again, emotional blackmail, right? I want to tell you that you hurt me, so I'm going to hurt you back and withdraw information from you so you feel the pain and put myself in a positive place, right? And then once you identify your need, you need to make a request. And you have to be aware that request may not be met. Again, this is very important because we have this assumption in our heads that we are going to make a request and people are going to do it. Because we are the brightest spot in the universe. When I close my eyes, all you guys disappear. You don't exist. You don't only exist when I open my eyes. Right? Because we're so self-centered that we have trouble recognizing how the other part of the argument lives. Right? So it's important for us to understand that even when you go through a process, you may figure all this stuff out and make a request and may not be met. And that's a different kind of conflict. Then it becomes a conflict in which you have to decide how are you going to operate. Because truth is, we cannot force people to do things. We want to. We really want to, even when we don't think about it, right? We talked briefly yesterday. Everybody wants change, but nobody wants to change. They want change. I want all of you guys to change. I'm fine. But if you guys were better people, the world would be wonderful for me. Right? It's basically what we do with our actions without thinking about them, right? That's what we do. It's kind of how we behave when we start to cut things off. So let's take a look, right? So the making observation piece. An observation is free of judgment, of label, of diagnosis, of opinions. So if I were to say, you always talk to the kids this way, that's not an observation. That's an accusation, right? So you would have to pick up an example and say, I noticed that yesterday you raised your voice when you were talking to little Johnny or Margaret, right? Is that an accusation? It may feel still like an accusation, but it's closer to a factual statement, right? So to help you get there, you can use this cue. Like when I see or hear or notice this, these are the things. You want to go into things here, right? And once you do that, you can, I'm going to run through this a little bit, right, because of time. But you then are having to dive into your feelings. You have to ask yourselves, that action that I didn't like, what did that cause in me? And this is a really difficult thing because we don't know how to handle our emotions to such an extent. This is interesting. If I were to, let's do a quick 30-second exercise. It's an individual exercise, okay? I want you to use your hands or paper if you have. For yourselves, don't talk to anybody else. Just count how many feelings can you name. Go. Need more time? All right. So, could you name 5 feelings?
Yes.
Could you name 10 feelings?
Yeah.
Raise your arm if you can name 10 feelings. All right. Who can kind of tell us a little bit about the feelings that they've named? Who would like to volunteer? All right. Go for it, Katie.
Simple. Happy, sad, mad, scared, anxious, frustrated. If I could think of them again. I was thinking for the
Yeah, it's okay. And you're in a spot too. So it's
okay. Overwhelmed, excited. Yeah.
oh, but hold on a second. Whose feelings are these, people? Like Katie, yeah? Huh?
Shy.
Shy, there you go. Right. So what if I told you there's like hundreds of them, right? And these are just a smattering of them, right? These are just a couple of them, right? There are literally hundreds of feelings, but I find it hard that we would be able to name all of them. I thought it was wonderful, by the way, that you did that. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for being our guinea pig. That was you model courageousness. Okay? So there's hundreds of feelings, literally, that we're not in tune. So if we don't know what they are, it's hard for us to describe, right? And sometimes we don't know the difference between them, right? And so it's an interesting perspective because sometimes when we have a feeling of excitement, we don't know if we're thrilled, if we're excited, what's the difference, because we haven't been thinking about this, right? But the important thing is our feelings are triggered every time our needs are not met. So the difficult piece is finding a way to express our feelings in a way that will get us there. And one way of doing it is saying, when that happens, when that event happens, I feel this way. Right? So it's a journey of self-discovery. The challenge is we also use the term I feel to talk about things that are not feelings. Right? Like, I feel like you're not being fair. Is that a feeling? No. Right? You see the difference here? No, there's no feeling there.
No, there is a feeling of a person who is saying, but you're not expressing.
There's a need somewhere, but there's no expression of feels. Like, I feel like you need to treat me better. That's not a feeling, right? That's, again, a demand. It's not even a request, right? I feel this sucks. Not a feeling. I feel like you don't hear me. Not a feeling. right? You see how we start making this about somebody else? And the idea here is you have to expose yourself. You have to bring you to the conversation, right? So that's really hard because we have been told that when we are dealing into conflict, we button up. We retain ourselves. We close our arms and we protect ourselves because the other part's not allowed to see any of me because I feel like if they see me, they will know that I'm weak and I will lose this argument. So what we do is we try to make about everything else other than our feelings. And then we don't know what we're asking for, right? So when I see you talking to our kids, or raising your voice to our kids, I feel sad. I feel hurt. I feel worried. I feel angry. You feel that way, right? It's very important for us to know that. And so when we do that, as we advance through our time here, the next step on your journey is to identify your need. This is really hard, especially in the beginning, because we're not used to doing this. Needs are universal, right? All of us have them to different degrees. And needs are the roots of feelings, right? So you have a need, for instance, for companionship. When you don't have companionship, you feel lonely. You feel neglected. You feel abandoned. These are different feelings that stem from the feeling of companionship. We all have these universal needs. We just don't talk about them because we feel like we're going to be exposing ourselves and it's going to make us weak, right? But we all have feelings, universal needs that are common. We have a need for for autonomy, for honesty, for safety. We have a need for love, for empathy, respect. The trick here is all of us have these needs. And so these are transferable. Like everybody knows this. So when you're able to identify that, you do an important leap in your discovery of self and a fundamental step forward in a relationship when you're reaching conflict. Because now you can understand what you actually want. Right? So John, on Friday night, you went to have a beer with your friends after you came back from work. I felt angry and hurt because I have a need for companionship and feel loved by you, and you chose to spend your time with other people than to spend time with me. This is different than you always going to spend time with your friends, right? One interesting thing is it helps you signal to the other person who sometimes is clueless that is important to you. Because sometimes we give half messages that are not fully internalized by the other person because they're thinking about something else. One example that may or may not happen or have happened in my household is at night when we are in bed and all of a sudden all I hear is, it's dark in here, huh? What does that mean? It means turn on the lights, right? But not for untrained men, right? Dark in here means like, oh yeah, it is dark. Right? You see here? You see here? So exactly, oh yeah, it's a fact, like, it is dark, right? Right? I'm overdoing here a little bit, but you get my point, right? And so it's like, followed by pout. And like, what's wrong, honey? If you don't know, I'm not going to tell you. This is not an episode of Seinfeld. This happens. It does not happen in my house, but this happens in many different places. And this contributes to other things if it does not go unanswered, right? So when you say, I really care being with you and I'm feeling lonely when you're not with me, it signals very clearly to people what your need is. Because guess what? Nobody else is responsible for making you happy. You are. As my former boss would say in her visionary words, you have to pull your own happiness wagon. Right? And this is really hard because we often think that our relationship is attached to somebody else. Not. Because if that person goes away, passes away, moves on, what happens to us? It's unfair for us to ask them to transfer this responsibility to them to make us happy. Lazy on our end in a little bit, right? And so we have to think about how is it that I make myself happy when I'm with other people. You can still be your own person, love somebody dearly, more than life itself, and still know that you're responsible for your own happiness, right? Does it make sense? And so when we have these conversations, it makes us identify our needs, and then we are ready to make a request. And a request is not a demand. Because what we make all the time is demand. We say, I need you to change the way you do things. When you say that, your assumption here is that you're in a superior position and you have control over what if somebody else does it. In a relationship, at the Spiritist group, with kids, or with a loved one, a spouse at home, that might not always be the case. That might be the case if you're a boss at work. The hierarchy is clearly established, and you have that authority. But in that equal relationship, which is most of the time how we operate within the Spiritist group, that might not work. Right? And with kids, sometimes that might not work, because they might just not accept your authority. Johnny, I need you to put your feet on the ground. Why, mister? Right? There goes your authority. Like, you just challenge your authority. Right? Does it make sense? So it's an interesting piece that we need to kind of... and so one way to cue us up is, would you be willing to do this? So you went and you had beer with your friends on Friday night as opposed to spending time with me. So I go back and I say, hey, when I get back home, I noticed that you were gone. I was really excited to see you because I wanted to spend time with you because I have the need of spending time with you because I love you and it's so enjoyable. Do you think that you'll be willing to spend time with me next Friday, Thursday, instead of doing that? Or can you help me come up with a plan? I use that with my kid all the time, right? Can you help me come up with a plan so that this doesn't happen or this happens? And I try to focus on positive actions, right? So one of the things, my kid is a really great kid. He's really easy. But one thing that he loves to do is run ahead. And I get worried as a parent as we go out. Our neighborhood is really safe, but parents worry about everything, let's be honest, right? So I worry that he's going to just run into the street. And I have that mental scene in my mind, cars, so I worry. And so every time, he's like, right? And so when he did that, the first time, I'm like, David! And he's like, right? And then I realized that me yelling wasn't helpful because he froze in the middle of the street, first of all, which is exactly what you don't want him to do, right? Because now if there was a car, he wouldn't have moved, right? He would have stayed right there. And so we called him up and said, hey, David. So I caught myself on the mess that I had done. And I said, hey, I kneeled down and I talked to him. Hey, David. I said, sorry, Papai was really scared there for a second because I saw you running into the street. And I got worried because I like you so much. I was worried that the car was going to come and hit you. And I need to make sure that you're safe. I have a need I need you to make sure that you're safe at all times so that you don't get hurt. Do you think the next time when you see a street, you can stop and check in with me before you go on? Right? Can we make a plan so that next time you want to cross the street, we find a way of doing that, right? It takes like 1 or 2 times, but it works. Now the little terrorist, whenever he goes, he runs, and he sees a street, and it kind of clicks, right? Right, and then he goes, right? But it takes a little bit of effort for us to kind of change the way we do things. to find a way of getting the results that we want. Kids are a lot easier, right? But with grown-ups, a little bit harder. Does that make sense? So the difficult piece here is this journey that we have to do to get a good grasp on our own feelings and needs. So if we were to go back to this hypothetical example, right? So we know what the behavior is that triggers you, right? So how do you feel when that happens?
I was trying to find out. Unsafe.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but how do you? So you feel worried.
I do.
You're great. And so if you were trying to emulate this method, do you think you can try to give it a go? Do you want to try to say, like, pretend that I am your hypothetical significant other? And how would you speak to me? This is really tough. This is really tough. You get a pass. If you don't want to do this, it's okay. We can ask somebody else to try it as well.
That would be a good practice.
Uh-huh.
And it's very loving. So you
I am
might
sure he
listen
is.
to me.
I am sure he is.
You might. It's that root, that habit.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed you yelled at the child
Mm-hmm.
when he was crying.
Mm-hmm.
I feel worried and unsafe
Mm-hmm.
when you hit him
Mm-hmm.
because he was crying.
Mm-hmm.
I need to feel safe, and I need the kids to feel safe. Do you think we can come up with a plan so you don't get so angry,
So you don't raise
so you don't hit?
a voice for kids. And right? How does that sound, people? It sounds beautiful. Sounds beautiful. Now, this is really hard, right? But you could feel the love in her voice. I could feel the love in her voice, right? And I think she did a beautiful job thinking about what did the behavior trouble in her, right? Because when you look at it, and this is the beauty of this format, I feel like, is that it starts to help you think about what needs other people have, right? And so you express the need for safety for your children, but also for yourself, indirectly, right? So when I heard that, I heard that you were worried for a second for the safety of your kids and also of yourself, right? And that's a powerful awareness for all of us, right? And he may not be thinking about it that way. He's just probably frustrated because he does not know how to operate when the kid is crying, right? Because oftentimes we don't know to, right? And so we kick into, oh my God, like, what do I do, right? And so because we have a need to be in control and to figure things out, we sometimes might lash out. So the question is, it also helps us think, what need does the other party have that maybe is also going unmet that we can help them through, right? There might be a need of also making sure the kid's okay and that frustration of not knowing how to handle that. But that conversation is essential. And it happens to all of us, guys, let's be honest, right? We all do things that we don't realize are triggering other people. And sometimes the perception from other people why we're doing it and our own is very different, right? And so it's great to have this conversation. And it's really hard because it requires us to really think about this. Now, if you were on the receiving end of the conversation, how would your response be to that? How would you feel about hearing what she said in terms of request?
Would think of they would I wouldn't feel accused.
Accused, yeah.
Accused, and
It'll make you think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's you gonna say something?
No, I just want to ask a question because I think there are moments, because if the person is angry, like,
Yes.
and just yell at the kid, that might not be the right time to do that, right?
Yes.
Because otherwise, like,
Yes.
he will still be angry, and then
Yes.
so there's got to be like a right time to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's important for us to also recognize here there's different levels of anger, right? There's frustration and there's anger, right? If there is anger and you're feeling unsafe, it's important for yourself, for you in that moment in time, and your judgment, which I don't think is the case here, is to remove you and your kid from the unsafe environment, right? And then deal with it later, right? Safety comes first. But it's true that sometimes it might not be the best time, but surprisingly, sometimes it is. Because the act of doing this non-violent communication where you're not challenging the person about the behavior, but you're coming with a proactive way and not a reactive way, and you're speaking with love, might actually jolt that person in that moment and snap that person out of it. If you were in the middle of that frustration, somebody turns around lovingly, looks at you and say, hey, it actually might be a good time. But we'll leave you to decide, because you will be the best judge on how to do that at that point in time, right? Do all of us do this all the time in our daily lives? No. Like, it's really hard for us to have this frame of mind because we are not used to it. But the invitation is for us to start thinking about how can we make sure that we think about our relationships with people in general, right? That make sense? All right. So as we move forward into the piece, right, and we are reminded about compassion and everything else, we say all of this because this way of being compassionate has to do about caring for others. And that's sometimes what we refer to charity. So there is no way for us to work on our relationships and to reach our quote, quote, salvation, which means spiritual development, without us being compassionate and careful about how we relate to others, right? And I think that's what Paul said when he did the whole modal change there, right? And of course, we base all of this on the Spiritist perspective, knowing that I think Bernadette did a great job of framing on the Q&A yesterday, if you were there, about how she had a tough conversation with her daughter, saying, hey, if we don't figure this out now, we're going to figure this out later. So let's figure this out now. So Spiritism gives us even more stuffing for us to know that we have to deal with the stuff. We have to deal with it. We can't shove it under the carpet because reincarnation will bring the really severe cases back, right? So we have to pay attention to that. And ultimately, I just want to remember all of us that conflict is part of life. It will happen. So let's equip ourselves to change our minds in relation to that so that we are ready to find a way. It does not have to be this communication method, people. This is just one tool, right, that I feel aligns with what we're trying to do in Spiritism, but go use another one if you want to. Talk to people. Find something that fits your needs. You have the free will to do that, right? And that connecting is essential because unless we connect, we won't solve those problems. That communicating is key. So are you communicating effectively? Are we communicating effectively? Am I communicating effectively? The answer is always maybe, right? There's always room for improvement. So think about that. And even if it seems redundant, talk about it. And last but not least, the idea here is very simple, right? In the Gospel of Matthew, we see this idea explained in the traditional way of life, but also in the way that Bernadette so aptly explained to us. Therefore, Jesus tells us, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled with them. Then come and offer your gift. And to wrap it up, the way I read this is you can do anything that you think is great in your life, and you can bring your best skills and abilities and gifts to the world forward and think that that's going to get you the farther in your spiritual development. But if you're not really being mindful of the relationships and challenges you have with other people, none of that will matter. God does not want to see that gift at the altar. What God really wants is to us to go back and talk to our brothers and sisters and make sure that we are okay. And then go back and develop the other people. Why? Because we are immortal spirits. And if we are not able to mend these relationships and work on them today, we will have to go back from the altar of our next opportunity to mend and address them. Because remember the commandments? Love your God of all things and your neighbor as yourself. That is the first. The second is like the first. To love God is to love your neighbor because it's the creation of God. As a parent, you want your kids to love each other. And so love is not just a feeling of romance. Love is also a feeling of helping them be the best that they can be and have a productive relationship in the most respectable and adoring way. So as we move forward, just remember that. And remember that you're incredible human beings doing incredible work. And especially at the Spiritist group context, this is not our day jobs. We do this when we have time, which means we are pressed for time. We are pressed for life. And we come sometimes with challenges of our day-to-day that spill over into our Spiritist work. And in that short period of time, we might rub people the wrong way. That's okay, because it's life. What's not okay is that we don't do anything about it. So, if you're in the receiving end of somebody rubbing against you, don't avoid them. Go ask them, did you really mean this? This is how you made me feel. And if you feel like you've rubbed somebody the wrong way, go talk to them and say, hey, are you okay? Because looking back on this now, I feel that maybe that wasn't nice, that wasn't my intention. You will be surprised how sometimes we are misinterpreted because we're rushing and people start making stories in the head about what happened and what did not happen, right? So with that in mind, I just hope that more and more you continue to do what you're doing this past 2 days, which is talking to each other about what works for you, what you're struggling with, and what you want for your children and for your groups. Because there's nothing more beautiful and nothing more important in the world than that. Thank you.
Well,
Energize us?
let's see if we can do a couple of this